hit record as always, and then we'll glad to be with you. We'll get started here. Last week, we were looking at the 12th chapter. Let's see, there he goes. Move everybody around a second here. We're going to the 12th chapter. If you don't remember, that's Mary washes Jesus' feet at the beginning of the chapter with pure nard. You have the triumphal entry, then you have the plot to kill Lazarus, and then Jesus teaching in the temple. And really, he sort of talks about people who don't believe, and goes through a sort of process again, saying that I came to save the world. And the real key, though, is instead of cleansing the temple, which he did as one of his first acts of ministry, and instead of cleansing the temple, like he does in the Synoptics, that is, one of his first acts of ministry all the way back in chapter 2 was cleansing the temple, right? So instead of doing that, he speaks to the Greeks and declares he's come for this moment. That is, so what we're going to see today is John continues to tell a very, very different story than the ones we're used to. So we'll just jump straight into chapter 13. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus answered, you do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand. Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, and not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, one who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you. For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason, he said, not all of you are clean. All right, so the story continues, but we'll pause real quickly. So John has radically reorganized Holy Week, certainly the ones that we regularly celebrate in the church and know. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus enters with palms, celebrations, he overturns the tables. Then he spends about a week in the temple teaching a whole variety of parables, stories. He does a little healing, all sorts of things in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then you have the Last Supper, right? In the Gospel of John, you have the entry, he teaches with the Greeks, there's a summation of his teaching, and then, boom, it's the Last Supper. It's this moment that we're talking about. So there is literally, it's almost, instead of Jesus entering on Palm Sunday, he really pretty much enters on Wednesday in John's timeline. It's the day before, or if not the day before, almost immediately before, maybe Tuesday at the most. But you get an idea that it just goes straight into it. So there's a very, very different timeline. And Jesus continues to teach after the supper, but in this case, it's purely to the disciples. So instead of teaching to the masses, to anyone gathered in the temple and the portico of Solomon, which is one of the great entry and open areas of teaching that anyone could come and hear what Jesus was saying, that's what happens in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John, it is purely the disciples, and it's after the Last Supper. And you get an idea, since it is literally 4 chapters long, that he has a lot to say after dinner. And again, the foot washing only shows up in the Gospel of John. That's the only place you will find this. So again, John has really a very different idea of how these last moments worked. So I have a question for you. What else is missing from John, from this passage, that you would expect to see? And Lynn, you can't answer. I know you have the answer, so. Karen, mom, dad, you want to guess what might be missing, what that you would think would be there?
I really don't know.
I'm not sure either.
All right, it's
Lynn can't tell us.
there's no bread or wine.
Oh.
Interesting.
It's the Last Supper. He washes their feet, but there is no bread, there's no wine. It's just after supper. And so while we will conflate and talk about all of these in sort of one term, and certainly on Maundy, Thursday, right, when we celebrate all this, we'll talk about how Jesus instituted the bread and the wine on this night. He does that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but then in John, it is only the foot washing. If you recall, it was chapter 5 of John where Jesus says, I am the bread of life, right? And so all of that terminology, all of that stuff that we get, that we use in the Eucharist, comes from a completely different point. It does not come in the Last Supper in John. Oh, here comes Roy. So it's a very different kind of model of what's going on. Instead, what we have is an action. Instead of having a meal, there's an action. And some theologians think that the community of John wanted the church to focus on servanthood and action versus receiving a meal, that there was a different way of being a community in the early church. Now, this is one of those things we're guessing. We're always guessing, really. Almost every theologian and writer, if they're honest about the work of the first century, are guessing because there's so much we don't know. But there are a number of folks, really starting with, and I've forgotten his name, who did all the study on the Gospel of John. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, one of the great writers of the 20th century said, there seems to be a sort of communities that sprung up around Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are very, very different from the community that seemed to grow up around this Gospel of John. And so he has a theory, Raymond Brown, there we go. Raymond Brown has the theory that really this was a separate church, right? That this was a church or maybe a group of churches that had a tradition that really adhered more to what John was talking about, and that they did foot washing instead of necessarily having bread and wine as their commemorative meal and remembering Jesus. It's all a guess, but it's an interesting one to walk down. And in that case, if it really was the fact that John there was a separate community that sort of thought these things, but did not engage Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then you definitely would have some very, very different actions within that community, right? There's not a moment where Jesus says, take, eat, this is my body. Instead, he says, wash feet, care for each other, serve each other, right? Much more mission-oriented church in the Gospel of John. If that really was a separate community, it'd be a much different process across the board. And then a couple of other quick things just within this text. He loved them to the end. This is a pun in Greek and in English. That is, he loved him to the end of his ministry, and he loved them absolutely. He loved them to the end of his being, his utmost. It can be both. And it's probably meant as both. He loved those people gathered completely, and he loved them to the very end of his life. Then I'm sure you all heard this. You've all been to plenty of Maundy, Thursday services. But washing feet was a deep sign of hospitality and service. If you think about it, everyone had the same things. They had sandals. And if you were walking on the ancient roads, they were dirty and they were dusty, and you would get sweaty, and that mud would literally just cake on your feet. So to enter and welcome someone into your home and to offer that hospitality, one of the deep signs of hospitality was just to let them freshen up, right? To wash their feet off so they could feel a little bit cleaner, a little bit better as they got into a meal or into time together, or spending time apart. But there are very clear Jewish laws that we do have that have been carried over that say that you can't even force a slave to wash feet because feet are deeply, deeply unclean, right? So there is this idea that there were tasks you could require of a slave to do: take out the trash, cook the meals, do 1,000, kill the chickens, 1,000 other things, right? But you could not force them to wash feet, even the slaves. So for Jesus then to enact that, to then say, I voluntarily wash your feet, which is not just a sign of servanthood, but even beneath servanthood, slavehood, and even beneath that to a certain degree, is truly, and it gets tossed around entirely too much with Jesus, but this is truly a radical sign of hospitality and of intimacy and of so it's a deep, deep sign of service. And again, this is where Raymond Brown, who is one of the great thinkers about the Gospel of John, would say if there was a community that was only formed by the Gospel of John, then it would absolutely be a community obsessed with service. Because this was absolutely the Last Supper, right? This was Jesus' main moment with his disciples, and he chooses not to give them bread and wine, meal for the journey. He chooses instead to say, you're going to serve. You're going to serve each other. And that's going to be a sign and a hallmark of what it is to be a Christian. All right. Questions about that first half, or we want to engage that? There's the second half of the story. There's a good portion that continues, but I wanted to pause before we got too far away from the action of washing.
You know, if you go back to the old Anabaptist backgrounds of the Mennonites and the Dunkers, foot washing, especially in the Dunker church, is almost as important as communion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to me that they focused on the foot washing so much in relation to, you know, these passages that we do it on Monday, Thursday, but they did it all the time. Well, they do it all the time if you're in an old Dunker church.
The same is true for the Mennonites. I know they also wash feet a great deal, and they are very clear as a community that their call is service, that you cannot be a Christian and sit at home. There's just not an option, right? Like you come, you wash feet, and now we're going to go take care of the poor in our community. And that's what it is to be a Christian. Full stop. That don't pass go, right? They're not as concerned with a whole host of other things that a lot of churches would get caught up in.
Well, that service thing and the foot washing are all hand in hand. And I've heard many a Dunker talk about it.
Absolutely.
I really love Peter's, doubt about this, and then questioning, why aren't you washing all of me? And I don't know, I just relate to that a little bit because so many of Jesus's teachings are so confusing. So.
Yeah. Well, I have this down for a little bit later, but it's certainly that exchange is worth talking about, right? That there's confusion. Like, no, you're not supposed to be washing my feet. If anything, I should be washing yours, right? I mean, there's almost that idea. And then there's also this very clear idea that Jesus gives that, well, of course you don't understand what's going to happen, but on the other side of Easter, you're going to understand, right? You're going to understand that I'm willing to die for you even. I'll put myself under your feet. And especially ironically enough, Simon Peter, right, as one who denies him. But it's this sort of very clear idea of service that is connected with crucifixion and with resurrection. It's all caught in that together in ways that, these are those great lines that they give that Jesus has, like, oh, you don't understand now, but you'll understand later. And we're like, it's 2,000 years later. We're still trying to wrap our heads around this one. Thanks, Jesus. We're like, this is not. Oh, we've all got this one perfectly figured out. It's like, oh, I don't know that we do.
The footnotes I'm looking at point out that verses 4 through 11 describe a one-time event, but once it's concluded, Jesus tells the disciples that this has affected a status transformation, or a conversion perhaps, that now they are, whereas he has been the master serving them, now it is their responsibility to go out and serve.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. We'll look at the second half because the story continues. But after he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? All me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. I'm not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but it is to fulfill the scripture, the one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I tell you this now before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may believe that I am. Very truly, I tell you, whoever receives one whom I send receives me, or receives me, receives him who sent me. That's that continuation then that Lynn was talking about with the footnotes, right? That there's this very clear idea that Jesus is handing this off. And this is sort of what I was talking about. Again, washing feet. When that exchange with Peter, it's not about being clean because not all are clean. And it's not about baptism because Peter makes that mistake. Right? He says, oh, well, then wash all of them. And he's like, no, you've already been washed. You've already been baptized. It's not about baptism. This is something else. It's best understood in that light of Easter. And it's one that you know that it's about service, but it's also one that if you've ever done that service, you know it's an intimate and connective moment, right? There's something very beautiful and elegant about it, and it's really not one that you can easily sum up with a theological reflection or statement or emotive experiential washing each other's feet. The reference, by the way, is Psalm 41:9, and that's pretty much exactly what it says. It talks about someone who will turn their heel, who has eaten with me, but will then turn against me. I've just always liked the symbolism there of Jesus just washed everyone's feet. So it will be a clean heel that turns on him. Right? It's one that even then Jesus still chose to clean the feet of the one who would betray him. Action to itself, right? What anything else for the foot washing?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to try to get a handle on what the word blessed means in this context. You know, if you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Some years ago, we had a Matthew scholar come speak to us, and part of what he was teaching about was the Sermon on the Mount. And so we get all these, you know, you get you're blessed if this and you're blessed if that, and which is in that context kind of hard to come to grips with. And so I asked him, what does it mean, blessed? And his answer was, you got it.
Okay.
Got it.
You finally.
And it was like you're really in, you know, you're really in tune with God. That was sort of my take on it. And you know, because well, you know, not to digress, but I mean, in the context of you know, you're blessed if you're poor and so on. It's hard to think about, but and so here I think it's interesting to think about what's meant by that, exactly how practically speaking, what is meant by blessed. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. In that context, I can certainly see that sort of mystic notion that you got it. You're at, that's putting you at one with God.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's good stuff. and I especially like that idea of you are blessed, meaning that you get it, that's the blessing, that's the gift unto itself, right? Is just, wow, you got some insight and you're doing good. You're with God. That's all the giftedness, the grace that you need. It's certainly not how blessed gets preached in some of the modern prosperity gospel kind of stuff, right? Like, if you know these things, oh, you'll make lots of money, or you'll be, all these other, it's like, I know that is not what it means in this context, right? That is not that at all what Jesus is saying, but it certainly makes a lot more sense to say, oh, you are blessed if you do them, that not that you're going to get something out of it, but you just understand, you're starting to get it. I like that. All right, so we'll keep going here. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me. Now the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter, therefore, motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him, and Jesus said to him, do quickly what you are going to do. And no one at the table knew why he had said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the festival, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out. So I'm going to start at the end. It was night, as it could literally be night after Satan enters Judas and goes to betray Jesus. But again, this is the same thing that happens throughout the Gospel of John. When good things are going on, Jesus is the light of the world. He is the light that we see by. Good things are happening when you're in the light. And when bad things are going on, it is nighttime, or you are in the dark, which meant the same thing then as it does now. Like if you're in the dark, you don't know what's going on, right? You're lost. We should understand that both literally and figuratively at the same time, probably more figuratively than literally even. So we just need to name that at the end. So the one thing I've got to work on, this is a NRSV, which I generally like. It's pretty close, but it is horribly mistranslated in verse 23. It should read, one of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining on Jesus's bosom or on his chest. I don't know why they chose just to say that he was reclining next to him, because that's not what it says. Literally, the word is he was reclining on Jesus's bosom, on Jesus' chest. And this is one of those things we have to take a quick note. We talked about it, I think, a couple of weeks ago, but Roman eating and dining practices, people ate on couches and they reclined. It was not like Da Vinci's wonderful Last Supper where everybody sat at a table and everything looked good. It looked instead like this. Much more, that is one of an artist's rendering of how it worked, but there would be tables in the middle and everybody would be laying around with cushions under their arms and dining and talking and hanging out. If you understand that that's how they eat, then it's not a problem to see how someone would recline their head against someone's chest while they were eating, right? Like this is a position that's possible. It's the Da Vinci's Last Supper and they're all sitting in chairs like we do in the West or in the modern world. That's a really awkward pose. How do you sort of crane your neck over to someone who's eating dinner next to you and just lay your head on their chest? Is a weird thing, but it's a very natural pose if you're looking at this. So that's an artist rendering of what it would look like. Here's one of the ancient Roman mosaics. And you can see again, this is how pretty much the
bones on the floor.
You
just threw all the bones on the floor.
You threw the bones on the floor, and that's the dogs would come in and take care of the bones, right? The animals would take care of everything else.
Yeah, there's a cat in the corner.
Yep. So it's a very different look and feel, and a much more casual kind of conversation and meal. It also helps you understand how you could wash feet easily. That is, everyone's feet are at the end of those beds and tables. It'd be very easy to go over and slip off their sandals and wash their feet. Even if they rolled over on their back, you could very easily wash their feet. Versus, again, if we're sitting in our sort of modern chairs, that's a really awkward, like, was he crawling under the table? All that kind of stuff. So the imagery is very different here than what we have been sort of given thanks to the high Renaissance, right? I love Da Vinci's painting, but it's not historically accurate, unfortunately. So the other thing we need to name, the final 7 chapters of John will be a moment where we really see the beloved disciple showing up over and over again, and he is constantly one-upping Peter. All right. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Peter is the rock on which I will build my church. Peter is the one who first says, "You are my Lord and my God," or "You are the Messiah." Right? At Caesarea Philippi, there's all of these kinds of moments where Peter is 100% the guy, but not in the Gospel of John. Instead, you have the beloved disciple, and the beloved disciple is the one who rests. How about Peter's? He rests on Jesus's chest. We should see that literally and figuratively, right? Like, he is the one who rests on Jesus's chest, on the bosom of Christ, which also means that there's an intimacy, and perhaps he's closer to Jesus's heart. He is, after all, the beloved, the one that Jesus loves. He shows up at the tomb first. He outruns Peter to get to the tomb first on that first Easter moment. He's the one, unlike any of the other Gospels where all of the disciples flee and they're only women. In the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple stays and is at the foot of the cross, and Jesus says, "Please take care of my mom." Right? So you have a very, 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 very different image of this idea of the beloved disciple, who incidentally is never named. We don't get like the beloved disciple, who was John, or anything like that. It's just, there's this one beloved disciple, commonly named John, that it's believed to be that's who it is, but it's just a name that we don't actually have that. Tradition holds that it's John, but who knows? And so here's the other thing that I love. While the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church proclaim the authority of Peter and say, it's Peter's seats, it's the keys of Peter, the keys of the kingdom, and on the rock Christ will build his church, the Eastern Orthodox claim the authority of John, the beloved disciple. They do not claim Peter. They say instead their authority comes from John, and Jesus loved him more. He was the beloved disciple. And so you won't hear or see it a lot, but there's lots of history there where the Roman Catholic Church will say, well, Peter is our authority, and Jesus gave him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And the Eastern Orthodox would go, yeah, but Jesus loved our guy more. He was the beloved. So they trace their authority to different branches there, and we'll talk about it in very different ways. All that to say, we sort of skipped over an actual moment of Judas betraying Jesus, right? We have this moment where he literally, the devil jumps into him and he runs out. And I saw a great reflection a number of years ago that was talking about the first action after communion, because it is, after all, the only point that we have in the Gospel of John where someone has bread and wine is when Jesus says someone will dip their bread into this wine. As soon as Jesus does that, Judas does that, he runs out to betray Jesus. And so there was a great reflection that even in worship, we can mess things up, right? That sometimes we can be Judas. We worship God, and then sometimes we go right out the door and mess things up pretty darn quick. But other thoughts, there's lots, gosh, there's so much going on here.
Well, that Jesus handing Judas the piece of bread, almost the imagery of that is almost to me like a perverse form of Eucharist, or the antithesis of what Eucharist is supposed to be.
Right. Absolutely. It's supposed to be a moment of deep communion, of connection, and instead it's deep betrayal and evil coming into this situation.
Mhm.
It's also handled a little bit more surreptitiously. That is, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a sort of dramatic moment where Jesus says, one of you will betray me, and Judas basically goes like, oh, you know who it is, and they get in a big fight, and they all know that it's Judas pretty quick. This one is much more subtle. John knows because or the beloved disciple knows because he's leaning on Jesus's chest and said, hey, who is it? He's like, oh, it's the guy I want to give the piece of bread to. So Jesus knows, and the beloved disciple knows, but it's not clear if anyone else at the table has a clue what's going on there. And then, in fact, it's explicit, right? The next part is, oh, they didn't know why he had said this. Maybe he's telling them to go get stuff for the festival, or he needed to give some money to the poor. So there's a sort of added layer of there really is. This is an insider, or inside the inside. I will say I'm glad we don't eat like this anymore because I don't think I digest very well.
It's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, laying in bed like that for an hour banquet or whatever does not seem it doesn't seem comfortable at all. But yeah, it was their custom. All right, so we'll go to the next part. When he had gone out, that is when Judas had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. And if God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. All right. So now the Son of Man has been glorified. You missed it. This is the entirety of Jesus's agony in Gethsemane. There is no moment in the Gospel of John where Jesus is wondering if he should do it. Instead, it's the exact opposite. He basically goes, hurry up, Judas, go do it. He completely embraces his fate. He knows what's going to happen, and it is his moment of glory to offer himself. That's just it. There it is. There's not, in the Gospel of John, there's not a moment where Jesus is worried or concerned about what he has to do. He willingly accepts his betrayal and death, and far from a moment of anxiety, it is literally the moment for which he came. It is the moment he is glorified, because everything is now being set in motion. Jesus' death and sacrifice is all part of it, and it's why he came, right? He came to reconcile us to God and to the world and to each other. That's the whole. And so this whole conversation then about being glorified and glorifying God is all because he knows he has done what he needed to do. Now that Judas has gone out to betray him, he can't stop it. It's all going to happen. The other thing, we call this the Thursday of Holy Week, Maundy Thursday. Some of you should know this. If you don't, I'll just a reminder. It comes from the, in Latin, mandatum. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, right? So Maundy Thursday is really just Commandment Thursday. And here's the thing that gets really hard when you are a priest and you're trying to preach or teach about Maundy Thursday. There are three distinct things that you are doing at the same time. One, you are taking Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the Last Supper and talking about the Last Supper and how it was instituted. Two, you usually have foot washing, which, as we just said, noted, is not part of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's only in John. And then three, you're talking about Jesus's new commandment. How will you know that you are disciples? You will know them by their love, right? And so you've got a very lots of mixed metaphors on Maundy Thursday. Which is why, if you've ever done that service, it is both a beautiful service, and if you sort of peel back the layers, it's a little bit confusing sometimes, because you're like, well, we're washing feet, but then we're also recognizing this Last Supper, but then we're also talking about loving one another. And then we're going to have a whole conversation about betrayal and denial and everyone leaving. And you're sort of like, whoo, there's a lot. There's a lot happening on Monday, Thursday. The other thing, love one another. This is the sign. If you want to know what it is to be a Christian, they will know we are Christians by our love, right? As the great song goes. This is also, though, just to jump into this a little bit deeper, the epistles of John go more deeply, go more in depth by declaring that God is love in 1 John 4:8. And they are absolutely explicit that the key to being a Christian community is loving each other, and it's the main commandment of Jesus. More important than anything else he gives us is we've got to work on loving each other. Right? It is in John, in the Gospel of John, but it really shows up more powerfully in the epistles in John 1, 2, and 3. The term is used, now there is a term though used 3 times in the epistles of John to describe those who deny Christ by hating their brothers and sisters. All right? So it's a term, it's only used in the epistles of John, it's used 3 times, and it's, or 4 actually, I guess, but it's really one is used twice in the same verse. It's just used a handful of times, and it's to describe those who choose not to love their neighbor. Instead of loving each other, this is the opposite. Does anybody know what that term is? You've all heard it a million times, but you've never heard it used in the correct context.
Bless your heart.
Not bless your heart. That's the Southern version.
Which bless your heart can be used a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's not it. This is always a shocker to good Christians. They don't realize it.
What is it?
Antichrist.
Oh my gosh.
Never said in Revelation. It is never mentioned in terms of the beast. It is never mentioned in terms of some horrible person that's coming at the end of days to kill everyone and destroy everything. The Antichrist, who is against Christ, is the one who denies his brothers and sisters, who does not love each other as Christ would call you to love them.
Oh
They're denying the Christ. And the answer of how do you love Christ? You love your brothers and sisters. It's all wrapped up in the theology of John. It's a fascinating term, but we don't talk about it ever. But this is 100%. This is all how these texts get wrapped on top of each other. But you are an antichristu, an antichrist, if you are one who chooses not to love your brothers and sisters, but to hate them. Which I would say we need to talk to both political parties about a whole lot right now.
Yep.
As they both claim to be Christians and both claim to be in the know and have it all figured out, I go, oh, as long as you're saying the other one's evil, you're out of the ballpark. You are in Antichrist territory, not in Christ territory.
I think there's a passage, I think in Acts, that in which it's saying, people are saying, look at those Christians, look how they love each other.
Yes.
And a couple of years ago in the EFM curriculum that's on life in a multicultural world, we had a writer who was dealing with interfaith relations. And he said, sort of the aspiration should be that people would say, look at those Christians, look how they love us.
Interesting. Yeah. That's good. Just a couple of quick, I'm going to give you a couple of quick notes about what's called the Johannine Corpus. And that was really defined as much by the aforementioned Raymond Brown as anybody else. There are 5 books attributed to John, to that writer. It's the Gospel of John, the 3 epistles of John, and the Revelation of John. And it was really the belief of Raymond Brown that those 5 books all emanated from the same community. They have the same themes. They use figurative language in very similar ways. So it's likely from either, if it's not a specific church, then maybe it was a group of churches. it'd probably be the equivalent of us saying in the modern world, right? Like, oh, that's sort of like the this denomination or that denomination wrote this book or wrote these series of books. The Mennonites really wrote this, or the Dunkards wrote this, or any other group, right? This is their theology and thinking and the ways they understood God, and they have a very specific way of talking about it, that Jesus and God is light, that the world is darkness and evil, that love is what it's all about, and that's what's going to be the way we understand God and the way we are called to understand one another, and it's through service. That a big key to the kingdom is service, not just to each other, but to those in need, right? And so all of this is that what's called the Johannine corpus, and they're all in there. I can say, and when I was in seminary, I translated about half of the Gospel of John and the first and third epistle of John. And that when you talk about reading that in the Greek, it's like reading a book from Hemingway and a book from Faulkner and saying it's the same author. They're not remotely the same author. You cannot say that the person who wrote the Gospel of John and the person who wrote the epistles of John, the style is just far too different. The same is true for Revelation. All three are very different, which is why Raymond Brown and some others have said it's not the same person. It can't be the same person. But it is most likely a community that had very similar value systems and a very similar understanding of God and a revelation of God. And that could be that the beloved disciple was John, or this person who helped write the Gospel of John. And then the epistles were the preachers and teachers, the disciples of John, who went out into the world. And the same for the revelation of John. There are lots of theories about how that worked. It doesn't necessarily matter. It's just a name that's how we talk about this group and how they interact. But there really is this very clear idea, that mandatum, that Maundy Thursday, right? Of I give you a command that you love one another, and this is how they'll know you are mine, right? That's the way you will know. Over and over and over again in lots of our time. Anything else we want to look at for this sort of conclusion portion of John's Last Supper?
I really like, I find useful the way in the message Peterson words the verses that deal with Jesus saying he's being glorified.
Okay.
Which I think is kind of a difficult concept, at least for me, to sort of completely come to grips with. What Peterson says is, when he had left, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is seen for who he is, and God seen for who he is in him. The moment God is seen in him, God's glory will be on display. In glorifying him, he himself is glorified. Glory all around."
Glory all around. There you
go. Which to me sort of gets at the notion of the the sacrifice is the glorification, but anyway.
No, absolutely. So one last, there's just about 4 verses left here. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Which, again, there are times when Peter can drive you nuts, but like Karen said, this is the time when you can definitely agree with Simon Peter. Like, hold on a second, we're having dinner. Where you taking off? What's happening here? And Jesus answers, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now. You'll follow afterwards." And Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you? I will lay down my life for you." And Jesus answered, "You will lay down your life for me? Well, very truly, I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. So here is that, and this is in all 4 Gospels, right? For both the betrayal by Judas and the denial by Simon Peter. The same is actually true even towards this that Jesus knew it was going to happen. But this is right up the line with everybody else. The main difference, though, is you actually get a sort of sarcastic crack by Jesus at the end, like, "Oh, you're gonna die for me? Really? You're about to betray me. You're about to deny me 3 times." You get a much more snarky Jesus response here than you probably get in almost all of Scripture, quite frankly. But that said, it's a very clear sort of back and forth conversation that you can see happening pretty easily. Yeah, the end is just the prediction of Peter's denial. That's the end of the Last Supper and John, or at least sort of the end. What happens next is super confusing, and it's super confusing because it all is discourse. So next week we'll look at chapter 14, which is the beginning of the last discourse or the final discourse, depending on which way they say it. And what is super not clear is, does it just continue immediately? Like, he has this conversation with Peter, like, well, you're gonna deny me 3 times. And then he starts immediately teaching to all the disciples at the dinner table, or do they sort of get up and go somewhere? There is a place where it's actually recorded that they get up and leave. So you, I guess, can assume that they're just sort of talking on the couches after dinner, but it's much more a conversation where Jesus is purely teaching. It is pure discourse. It is pure him just telling people what's going on. And so you end up a very different thing. So literally the next 4 chapters are some of the densest teaching you will find anywhere in theology and Scripture, which we'll try to jump into next week. But they are, it's deep water, to say the least. Anything for the rest of for chapter, anything in chapter 13 at all about Peter's denial, Judas's betrayal, washing feet, life in general?
Bill, I do have a question.
Yes, sir.
This is going back to, we were talking about blessing earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And when a priest gives a blessing to the flock, what does that mean?
The blessing of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be upon you, remain with you always.
Right.
That is certainly much more in terms of the Aaronic blessing, not ironic, but the blessing of Aaron back in Numbers, where Moses' brother says, "May the Lord look upon you and shine favor upon you and lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace," right? The idea of blessing in that case was always that God would go with you wherever you're going. And sometimes you'll hear that. Sometimes people will do that ancient blessing that says, God watch between you and me while we're absent one from another. And then that leads into the blessing. But that's much more of the connotation, I think, of the blessing, is this idea, this is a catch-all as you go out into the world, right? We know the world is a tricky place and we're glad to all be together, but we don't know when exactly we'll see each other again. And so God to go with you, and I hope he goes with me and goes with all of us. Is that understanding? That's the understanding I've always had of when I'm saying the blessing, that what I'm doing is to wish the best possible favor and the best possible life in God's presence with you each step of the way.
Thank you for that explanation. As long as I've been an Episcopalian, I've never heard quite that good explanation.
Good. Glad it struck home, but yeah. But it's tricky. It's like Glenn was saying, earlier when we were saying, like, what does it really mean to have God's blessing? Or what does it mean to say blessed are the poor? And the word is used in a lot of different ways. So I think that it's a malleable word enough for that to have different meanings in different contexts too. All right, my friends. Anything else from all this? I'll stop the share and we can just do that for a second. Anything else that we want to engage? We had a great service Sunday night. Weather was perfect. And we will, I'll be sending out a letter to the parish today, tomorrow, depending on when, or probably tomorrow, that just announces we're going to do an 8 o'clock, a 9 o'clock, and a 5 o'clock on starting on weather conditional, of course, because it all has to be outside, but starting on All Saints Day on November 1st. So let people, so that way we can maybe get 150 people between those 3 services at church. They're outside. It's super easy. Everybody felt safe. Lots of people of different ages were there, and just could sit and pray and be together. And it was just good. I can say it's if it's not the first time, it's one of the few times that I got the service got a standing ovation just because people were so happy to be together at the end. Just go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Everybody just started clapping because they were happy to be together. So it was good. It was a sacred day. Good to be back together.
So is that 5 o'clock again this coming Sunday?
Yes, it will be at 5 o'clock again this coming Sunday, and that'll just be ongoing. Instead of doing, obviously we usually do that at 6, but with the time change about to happen, if we did a 6 o'clock, it would be pitch black out there before the service even started almost. So we just had to shift that around a little. It's for the time to make sure we had light.
So will there be a service that will be streamed like?
Yeah, the 10 o'clock service will still be streamed. That will be ongoing regardless.
Okay.
It's just we're going to have those outdoor services at 8, 9, and 5, which really, the only difference from before pandemic would be we usually had 8, 9, 11, and 5, or 8, 9, 11, and 6. So this is a little bit different, but as far as somebody was asking about how much time this is going to take for the clergy, I was like, oh, this is just what we used to do. In a not so distant land, we used to have 4 services on a Sunday, and we have the clergy to do that. It won't kill us. In fact, we're excited about doing it, really. So.
And then Bill, how is it communicated if there's going to be a weather cancellation?
Really, it's sort of like the weather rock, as we used to say in Boy Scouts. If the rock is wet, it's raining, right?
The weather rock.
That'll probably be how you know it's canceled. I mean, it's nothing really more complex than that. We'll try and have it as long as it's not raining, pretty much, or thunder and lightning, right? But if it starts raining, just because we've got like a little altar out there and stuff, we're not, and a little speaker system, we're not going to risk anything in the wet. But that's a good thing. I should probably add that to the letter, just to say, like, obviously, if it's raining, we won't have it. We're not going to try the umbrellas and to brave the elements. We'll just cancel and look for the next one.
So it's limited to how many people, Bill?
It is pretty much 45 or 48. It's 50 total, but that has to include myself in that total, as well as an usher to just help with getting people gathered up, and a reader. So I think we had either 47 or 48 that were listed for the service, and it's just a first come, first serve, whoever can sign up. And, we weren't sure for the first Sunday how that would go. We had 30, on Friday, we had 16 signed up. By the time the service started, we had 32 total. So there was, people want to come, but there's just a lot of hesitance and unsure about what people are comfortable doing. So I'm sure some of these will probably get in a rhythm that number's a little bit higher, but it's hard to say. It wouldn't surprise me at all at the same time if each of those services was more like 30 people for a while.
You have to bring your own chairs?
Got to bring your own chair. Yeah, that's the tricky part.
And your own wine and beer?
What's that?
And your own wine and beer?
Yeah. Yeah. We don't really have that, but yeah, you're sure. You got it. BYOB and everything. The good news is the bishop has allowed us to do communion in one kind. So we did do communion just bread, which was, I think, part that people really appreciated too, was just being able to have at least, it was pre-wrapped communion, which is a little different, but that's okay. People got it, so they were happy. Context is everything, right? If I had told you a year ago that I was going to do a service for 50 people outside and I was going to give you pre-wrapped communion, I think people might have fired me that afternoon. Nowadays, people are like, that's the best idea I've ever heard.
Yeah.
When we went out to, oh gosh, when was it? Must have been 2 must have been a year and a half ago, we went out to California to see our nephew in a play, and we ended up going to All Saints Beverly Hills and connecting with the Daniels.
Yeah.
They had little their gluten-free wafers were pre-wrapped in a cellophane that had a picture of wheat with a circle on the line. So that's been my only pre-wrapped experience.
It's a little different, but it all,
There's a church here in Memphis that has the wafer pre-wrapped and it sits on top. You know, those little things like you get sauce in for your hamburger or your whatever, except it's about that big around. Oh, there it is, that big around. And that has the wine in it. And then they have the wafer in the cellophane stuck on top of it. So you can take the wafer out and then slurp the wine.
Oh.
Yeah. We talked about getting those, but I think that was the Ultra Guild decided that was a field too far. They were like, we're not
gonna
getting the
start out with the
juice
bread.
and bread. We'll just go with the bread.
Yeah.
Well, good to see all of you, my friends.
Thank you, Bill.
All right.
Y'all have a great
good
day.
Have a great
Thank
week.
you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
Bye.